here. All right. I believe we're ready to roll.
All right. Sorry about that. Good evening. I will call to order the Riverside City Council work session for Wednesday, November 10th, 2021. If you would please all join me to rise and pledge allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag
of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Yeah, I'll move over. Keep it.
Thank you. Thank you. And Madam Clerk, would you please call the roll?
Ms. Campbell? Here. Mr. Denny?
Here.
Mrs. Franklin?
Here.
Ms. Fry?
Here.
Ms. Lomach?
Yes.
Mr. Maxfield?
Yes.
Mayor Williams?
Here. No absent members. Mr. Manager, any additions or corrections to the agenda as presented?
No, Mr. Mayor.
Do we have a motion to approve the agenda as presented?
Motion. Second.
We have a motion from Mr. Maxfield and a second from Mr. Denning. All those in favor of approving the agenda as presented signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, say nay. Agenda is approved. Mr. Manager, over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Similar to last week, is there anybody, would it be okay if I doff my mask for the purposes of delivering this?
Please.
Thank you. Just would help, I think, on the Zoom, make things a little clearer as well. Okay, bear with me here. Let me get this PowerPoint rolling. Let's see, we want to go from the beginning, and then I'll share the screen. All right. So thank you again, everyone, for coming, and to all the department heads for being here as well. This pen. I appreciate everybody being here tonight. The budget is obviously the document by which we live and breathe as an organization, and so I think it's often worth it to take some time to get into a bit into the weeds in terms of what we're looking at, what we're dealing with, and how we can proceed moving forward. So I have a slide deck prepared here. I will try to be relatively brief, kind of going through. I want to say at the outset, though, that feel free to pause at any time if you have questions. I've also built some slides in here where we can take sort of short breaks to follow or check in with questions if you have any. But we'll keep it as conversational as we can going forward. So the agenda this evening, we'll do a little bit of housekeeping. That'll just be very brief. And then I have three central questions that I want to explore, which is, where are we now? Where are we going? And in the where are we going section, I'll dive into the weeds on the budget pieces. How do we get there? And then some space at the very end for additional follow-up or discussion. So on the housekeeping note as well, the first thing to say is a big thank you, especially to the staff for bearing with me. It's been a whirlwind of 3 weeks since I kind of came into this position and have been drinking a bit from a fire hose, getting my feet wet and getting acquainted with things. And obviously the budget is a pretty central part of that. And I appreciate all of staff's patience and flexibility and all the feedback that I've gotten from them and council sort of throughout this process. I've asked the department heads to come here, particularly so that we all can be on the same page and we're all singing from the same music as far as what the discussion is and what things are said at the meeting, but also if my presentation is fairly high level, if there are detailed questions that you have about particular line items or things like that, and I'm unable to answer them, they can certainly backfill and help participate in that respect as well. Another quick thing, one of the questions that you do not see on this list is how did we get here? And that is not a question that I have had a sufficient time to answer. And I'm also not confident that we will find any answers to that question satisfactory. What I can say is that given the 7 years that I've done consulting and in communities and environments that are similar to the one that we find ourselves in presently, there is often not a single person that you can point at, not a single event. These are really culminations of years worth of environmental changes and other decisions and sort of circumstantial happenings that result in sort of where we are. And so the focus and thrust of this presentation really is intended to give us a clear-eyed view of where we sit presently and to talk about how we can start to move forward as an organization out of that as well. So where are we now? I would say that, in the 3 weeks that I've been here, I have some observations about sort of our process and the way we've historically done some things. So our budget process has historically been a little bit fluid. We've relied on reserves to cover operating costs, similar to how I discussed last week. And as a result of that, our fund balances in several funds, particularly the general fund, are nearing some fairly critical levels. That is really the result of a variety of economic factors, I think, that have particularly this year intensified the budget constraints that we find ourselves in. And the top three things that come to mind for me when I look at the data and where we are, really it boils down to a product of the changing economic environment post-COVID, kind of where we are with all of that. We lost 2 major tenants at Right Point this year. And our operating costs, like everybody else's operating costs, have increased and are likely to continue increasing due to inflation, supply shortages, general contractual increases that we give to our personnel through for salaries and wages, things of that nature as well. And like we discussed last week, there are some cases where our capital infrastructure commitments have exceeded the available funding that we have to carry out some of those projects then in the out years. We'll get to Fund 702. There are no real substantial changes aside from what I presented last week as far as which projects we're recommending proceeding with. Just as another brief recap, this chart should be familiar for folks. This is just a chart showing fund balances in several of our major funds. The big green line on the top is the general fund. The orange line in the middle is Right Point. The main idea to convey here is that when I say earlier that we've been drawing against fund balances and now some of those are down at critical levels, this is sort of the picture of that. So we entered this year with about $3 million in general fund, with Right Point down at about 300,000, and the FY22 budget will set the stage for us to reduce reliance on fund balance going forward, but that is going to be a bit of a process to get there. Issue 9 is a huge win for our community. It alone helped to stabilize the existing police, fire, and EMS costs that we carry as an organization. And we are going to do exactly what we said we would do to the voters. We're going to dedicate 100% of those revenues to police and fire. And on top of that, the general fund in this budget will continue to support some operations, particularly in the police department, as well as capital for debt service that we're paying for things like turnout gear, medic units, engines, those sorts of things as well. Going forward, FY22 is going to be a very pivotal budget year for us. We have the draft budget that I presented you all with establishes a reasonable baseline under the new income tax structure. So we should bear in mind that because now our income tax rate is 2.5%, but we're also doing more credits back, the entire methodology by which that's calculated will change compared to the old way we were doing it. The budget aligns our infrastructure spending with available resources. We are identifying the specific demands on the general fund, which are causing us to dip into our reserves. And we're going to create a framework for assessing how our revenue is coming in and our expenses and expenditures going out, so that we can pay attention to when and how we're having to dip into savings to cover our operating costs. Where are we going? So again, a little bit of a recap from last week. The budget model that we put together holds most of our revenues flat, with the exception of gas taxes, which have been increasing in recent years. We're inflating our operating expenses. We're still projecting about a 35% increase in health insurance. We've made some headway with our broker on that front, but I have not had specifics about what a likely increase may or may not be. We're hoping to hear by the end of next week so that we can apply those numbers and carry that forward into open enrollment. And then we applied these projections to each line item in 22. And I ran all those numbers by the staff a few times. We've adjusted some of those projections based on our performance year to date and some specific feedback that the departments had. So everybody's had a view of the budget that's been presented to you to date. quick high level slide here. It's tough to see the caption, unfortunately, on Zoom, but this is a pie chart that shows what all of our revenues are by source across all of our funds. So when we get money as a city, where does that money come from? And what I'm showing here is the average across the last 4 or 5 fiscal years. So basically from 2017 through year to date 2021, where is our revenue coming from? By and large, it's income tax, which again is typical for most Ohio communities. The green wedge down here toward the bottom represents bond proceeds. That's at about 28%. This pie chart is a little bit skewed because we annually issue a note related to Right Point that's debt that we repay every year, and it's sort of a rolling cycle to pay that note on Right Point. The reason we do that is because we've gotten very good interest rates and it's been very inexpensive to do that, but that's why the pie chart shows such a big slice here. We also get money from real property taxes, grants, fees, and permits, and then basically everything else we collect from is that 21% up in the corner. A brief note on income tax. Last week, when I was giving you kind of a high-level overview of where we were with income taxes, I mentioned that we were estimating about $9 million in revenue based on receipts to date and where we felt like we were going to end up by the end of the year. We also reached out to CCA to do a separate analysis of income tax under the new 2.5% structure with the new chargebacks and to sort of double check us, confirm. And they came in with an estimate that's around $8.6 million in total income tax revenues for the city, which according to the vote, we will split. So 1% will get dedicated to the general fund, 1.5% of the 2% would go to police and fire. And the bold numbers at the top there are what you see, how that would effectively break out. So of that 8.6 million that CCA is estimating we would bring in, if we collect all of it, about 3.4 million would come to the general fund, 5.2 would be split between police and fire. And then we'll net out a little bit less because we have to pay collection fees to CCA for the privilege of gathering that money. In terms of expenses, where does our money go? Personnel, again, not uncommon. The large green wedge down here at the bottom is that debt service, again, largely reflective of the Right Point note that we pay back every year. And then our other costs are generally tied up in operating and capital as well. So the city has 42 different funds that we use in our budget. Most of those funds, or I should say, some of them we have dedicated to specific departments and functions. Others we use for really specific accounting purposes. So they're designed to receive revenues related to a particular grant, for example. Like the CARES Act funding is a good example of that. We use that fund to gather and spend that grant, and then we're not using that fund anymore. So a fair amount of our funds are rather administrative, you could say, in nature. Of those 42 funds, the key funds that really jump out are the 9 that are listed here on the right side. That's the general fund and all the city hall departments that are supported by that, fire service, police. I've included ARP because it's of note. It's contemporary. We're likely to draw on that going into next year, and we will also receive another tranche of money in the next year. Right Point, the Fire and Police Income Tax Fund, Capital Infrastructure, and Capital Equipment. So those are kind of the 9 funds that really account for most of where our money comes from and goes with respect to our budget. The chart that I'm showing you here is a summary of the draft budget fund balance document that I sent out earlier this week. This is the 9 funds we just talked about. Because these are the most major funds in our budget, what I'm showing here is the estimated beginning fund balance that will go into 22 with, fiscal year 22 with, what we're likely to use in terms of what we're likely to draw on fund balance in order to get through the end of the year. And then the final column shows what we're estimating our ending balance will be in each one of those funds. The principal thing I want to draw your attention to with this chart, and even in the more detailed chart that's in the PDF that I shared, is that of all of the funds, the one that relies most on its fund balance is the general fund. So the general fund we're projecting in fiscal year 22 will use just over $1 million of fund balance in order to get through the budget year. Last week, we talked about how if we get to a certain point, so the GFOA, the Government Finance Officers Association, recommends having at least 2 months of revenues or expenses in reserve in your general fund. You know, a month's worth of expenses for us is anywhere between $600,000, $700,000 or so. So what this chart is showing us is that if our budget is, if we stick to our budget going into 22, and we end the year with about $860,000 in the budget, that's about a month and a half's worth of expenses. We can backfill that. We have about 300,000 in our contingency funds to bring that number up a little bit higher if we would choose to do that. But the key takeaway there is that we cannot have another year where we dip in or we're going to go below. And just doing a bit of research and homework today, based on what I had seen as far as how low we can go in Ohio, we will basically enter fiscal caution territory with the auditor if our balance goes below 1 month's worth of expenditures. So we need to end 22 with at least 1 month's worth of expenditures in fund balance reserve, or we're going to have a different set of problems that we'll have to deal with going forward into 23. So the general fund. What I'll do over the next couple of slides is kind of dive at a very high level again into each one of these 9 funds and show you what's coming in and what's going out, and maybe provide a little bit of context about some of that. So we just talked about how the general fund is where most of our transfers are going out. When we look at the general fund, this bright green section here on the bottom is what we think we'll begin the year with. Again, this is a conservative beginning balance assumption. The whole budget is fairly conservative in that way because I would rather not overpromise and then have to adjust. I'd rather tell you we have more money than we thought, especially given where we are today. So if we begin the year with about 1.9 million, we expect then to generate about 4.6, 4.7. That represents the new income taxes, as well as all the other revenues we typically accumulate in the general fund. And on the expenditure side, the budget, we're budgeting for about 5.7 million in expenditures. The key thing with this chart is that there are, I believe, 9 departments in the general fund. So a department would be city council, elected officials, city manager's office, finance, community development. The largest department is Department 110, which is down here at the bottom, general government expenditures, or general government, excuse me. General government in next year's budget will spend about $3.8 million. All of the other city hall departments combined will spend about 1.9. And you might ask, why is that? The reason why that is because general government is where we're doing the transferring to other funds to help keep them afloat. Of that $3.8 million that general government is spending, about $3.3 million is transfers. So 87% of the money that general government spends is being sent to other funds to help keep them above water. This pie chart shows all of those transfers from general government to other funds. The money that we're transferring to support other funds typically generally goes 3 places. It goes to the public service fund, and next year that's about $1.4 million. It goes to capital equipment, which is Fund 703, and that supports the existing debt service on, a fire apparatus, turnout gear, as well as a little bit of infrastructure. And it goes to other funds, which is a line item that in this case represents Right Point. So, basically where we're landing here is that most of the money coming in, most of the money being transferred out of general government, 92% of that money goes to just those 3 funds. When we talk about budgets that have structural challenges, this is what we mean. Because we have operating costs in public service that require support from the general fund. We have debt service in these other funds that require support from the general fund. And we have a Right Point fund that now also requires some additional support. And there's no other revenue that I can reach into to help make these funds whole. And so as a result, we keep digging down into reserves to bridge that gap. So that's what we mean when we say a structural imbalance or a structural challenge with the budget. It's really right here with respect to our operating costs. So I want to go through each one of those three funds briefly in turn, just to, again, give you a little bit more detail. In the service fund, again, we have revenues on the left. And in this case, the blue is transfers in from the general fund. So the service fund, creates some revenue or is able to assess some fees to help support itself. It relies on the general fund, though, for about that $1.4 million. On the other end, though, where we're spending the money, you can see here, most of it is related to personnel. And we're contractually obligated to increase some of those wages and salaries then going forward over the next couple of years. The operating costs in service are, about a third or so of the overall expenses expenditures in the department. The salary increase, I believe for most of the contracts is relatively similar. It's something on the order of 2.25% per year, if I recall correctly. One item of note, in the line items, you may have noticed there is a line item in here which reflects it's about $100,000 for the creation of an ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act transition plan. That is something that I have included in this budget as an operating expense. So it's part of this 694. It is somewhat optional. If we do not do it, at some point, our ability to secure additional grants, I believe for MVRPC, will be reduced. We have the option of not moving forward to help add to our fund balance next year, but it is something that we should do federally anyway at some point, just to be sure we're staying in compliance. In the capital equipment fund, that's Fund 703. This fund is totally reliant on transfers from the general fund, and it's an administrative fund to pay debt service, so that's not unusual. The buckets of debt that this fund is paying for come in three flavors, if you will. So we have debt service for capital infrastructure, service for existing capital equipment, and that would again be the vehicles and other things that we've already bought that we're paying for. And then a new capital equipment category down here, which reflects radio upgrades for the police department. And if we don't replace them, they will no longer work. And so we have to replace the radios, as well as about $150,000 for a financial system upgrade for the city. One thing to note here is that going forward in 23's budget, fiscal year 23's budget, the debt service on capital here, I can transfer to Fund 702 because this is debt service for things related to streets and other things. We can use some of the dedicated money for gas tax and motor vehicle tax to help pay for that kind of debt service. This 290 also includes a very early estimate of what we would owe on a bond payment if we proceed with our plan to bond out for the capital projects that we've talked about in 702 and do those projects to carry us over into next year. So I've already baked that future debt service payment into the budget. Right Point. Right Point is Fund 402. You can see here where I mentioned earlier, the big wedges of the pie chart that note, that's these two big blocks here in the middle. So next year, we're anticipating issuing a note for about $4.9 million, and we'll need to repay that note plus some interest by the end of the year. The revenue in Right Point, we're projecting at about $600,000. Colliers is still helping us to work on fleshing out specifically what that revenue number may be. The wrinkle with Right Point is that we lost 2 tenants this year. I think the initial forecast for Right Point were something on the order of $800,000, which reflected that revenue from the tenants that we lost. So because we've had some changes this year, when I mentioned earlier, some things happening that have sort of intensified the position that we're in, that's one of those things. Losing that revenue from those tenants has put the Right Point Fund at a place where it will need more support from the general fund than we had anticipated several months ago. So I know that's a lot to throw at you all at once. As far as operating costs, though, in the general fund and some of these other funds and transfers, any questions at this point?
Did you mention a few slides back, Josh, that the way that the state was calculating our amount, our borrowing capacity essentially, or maybe that was an auditor issue. Has there been a change? Did you mention that our ability to continue to spend into reserves would be limited based on a changing standard, or has that always been the case?
My understanding is that's been the case for some time. I can double check. What I was referring to is that when you go visit the state auditor's website and they publish guidance for communities that are in fiscal caution, fiscal distress, or fiscal emergency, there are specific sets of criteria under each of those categories, which can trigger a community basically falling into one of those buckets. One of the buckets for under fiscal caution is if we end the year with a fund balance that's less than 1 month's of operating in the fund, in the general fund specifically, then that triggers basically a fiscal caution condition, and it would, I assume, trigger then some additional oversight from the auditor, state auditor. So sorry if to confuse it. It's not expressly related to debt. It's more about how much money are we ending the year with in the general fund itself.
Thank
you. Mm-hmm.
I don't know who the appropriate person to answer this question would be, but on page 16, could someone explain the difference in the 2022 draft budget versus years prior for account number 5901, 5902, 5903? Transfer from police and fire. So with the passage of the income, this is just for my education. So with the, right, but it's a lot smaller than the years prior. So with the passage of the income tax, is kind of the purpose of that is the income tax was.
Oh, we'll get there.
Okay.
I'm going to do that next.
Okay.
The next section is public safety, so I can move right into that. With respect to public safety, the place to start is in Fund 410. That's our fire and police income tax fund. When we talk about taking the revenue that we're going to get from the income tax and split it, dedicate it to public safety, this is where that happens. When we get receipts in from CCA, we split that, or we will split that 60-40 going forward. 60% will have to go to public safety, police and fire, because 1.5% is 60% of 2.5%. And then the remainder will go into the general fund. So what Fund 410 will do is collect that $5.2 million in anticipated revenue from the new income tax, and then it will transfer that money out to the public safety departments. So what I'm showing here is a transfer to police of about 3.2 million, to fire of about 1.8 million. And this little operating down here represents, again, the administrative overhead costs that we have to pay to CCA to collect these monies and transfer them. In fire specifically, when we look at revenues coming in, the fire department already gains revenue from things like EMS billing. That's kind of in this green box here. The transfer from 410, again, that's the dedicated income tax that would come in, would be added to that. And then we're estimating that fire would begin the year with about $400,000 in reserves, or in beginning balance. And that is a function, we'll get to it in a little bit, but that's a function of us offsetting some COVID salary costs with ARP money. So in effect, fire will begin the year with a little bit more money in the bank because we're able to offset this year's costs with the ARP grant. And then we'll add these additional revenues on top of it next year. Fire's major expenses, again, not surprising, are in personnel as well as operating. And here, as with other contracts and departments, we can anticipate that personnel cost, the salary component of it, will increase about 2.25% per year through the life of the existing contract. And the other thing to consider in fire is that I believe it's 23, Chief, reel me in if I'm wrong, the SAFER grant drops off. And right now that's about $65,000 in grant funding that we'll no longer receive. So we'll have additional operating expenses that will come online once that grant goes away. But for the purposes of the next year's budget, the fire department will be solely reliant on revenue that it brings in and transfers from the dedicated income tax, effectively. In police, it's a very similar story. So police also gains revenue from real estate taxes and the taxes that have already been dedicated to it. The transfer you see here again would come, that's the dedicated income tax straight from 410 into police to support operations. Despite that transfer, the police fund will still need about $170,000 or so from the general fund to break even based on where our operating costs are currently today. Again, those operating costs are largely reflective of personnel, and we'll have some future increases there according to our contract, as well as operating costs. So to sum up, we'll do exactly what we told voters we would do with respect to the income tax initiative. We will take 100% of these funds and dedicate them exclusively to police and fire and public safety purposes. On top of that, the general fund will continue to help support police operating costs. And the general fund will support debt service that we're carrying on, cruisers and fire apparatus and other equipment that's in Fund 703 currently. The way that the next year's budget is structured, the purpose really is to avoid drawing on any fund balances that public safety may have going into the year. Again, I wanted to avoid a situation where it even looked like we were taking extra money that was on the table from public safety and giving it to a general fund purpose. I'm not sure that we could do that anyway because of the constraints of the ARP money and that grant. But this was also deliberate to try to give our public safety folks some breathing room with respect to anything that may pop up next year, emergency repairs, other things, to have a little bit of extra padding and cushion in those funds to help deal with anything that may arise. Overall, what we're looking at between the general fund items that we've just looked at and the public safety funds that we're looking at is an overall goal to stabilize the general fund going forward so that we can support continued investments in public safety and other budget priorities to help achieve some of the things that we talked to the community about this year in the run-up to the vote last week. So we effectively have to stabilize operating costs on the general fund side to help make room so that we can move forward and build back our fund balances and advance the budget priorities from there. That will require time, and it will also require some pretty intensive oversight of our revenue and expenditure trends next year, all year long. Any questions about public safety funds? So the last two that I have just to brief you on, the first is ARP, that's Fund 237. We were initially awarded about $1.3 million in ARP funds. The thing to note about ARP funds is the strings attached to those funds are much more restrictive than earlier grants like the CARES grant and other similar grants that we've received. So under the statute, under the law, we have the ability to spend this money for anything related to water or wastewater, and that would include things that bring us into greater compliance with the Clean Water Act, so stormwater related activities. And this year's budget includes some money for those types of expenses. We're also using the funds then to help offset, as I mentioned, COVID-related payrolls in the fire department to give us a little bit more padding and balance coming into next year for that. Where that leaves us is with an ending balance of about $274,000 or so in this fund. And I have not projected any additional uses of this fund for now. Because this is a one-time funding source, I imagine we'll get into next year and there will be things that come up related to stormwater or stormwater engineering that we will likely be able to use these funds for. But because we don't know what those will be yet, I'm essentially holding this in the bank to give us as much flexibility as possible to use going forward into next year. On top of that, we'll get another tranche of money. It's another 1.3 million or so that we can continue to use for these purposes. And I'm working with Tom on rerunning some calculations with respect to whether or not we experienced a revenue loss due to COVID. Earlier, the calculation was that we had not. I'm reasonably confident that that calculation is correct, but I want to double check according to some guidelines that GFOA released. We're kind of in a position where we did experience some losses, but we were made whole through some funds that we received from the state. And I want to be sure that we're using any ARP money as appropriately as we can going forward. So we will work on that. And again, this will be a resource we can potentially tap for certain activities in fiscal year 2022. With respect to Fund 702 and infrastructure, this is essentially the same slide that I showed everyone last week. The idea is that 702 brings in about $860,000 a year in revenue. We are going to also tap some ARP money next year to help us achieve some stormwater components of these projects. The actual project list here has not changed. Tom and I met with our municipal financial advisor earlier. Was that this week? Yeah, time flies, or it all blends together. We spoke with them earlier this week, and they are comfortable with sort of this course of action in terms of having us go forward to bond out these capital infrastructure projects to the tune of about $1.4 million or so. And the very back of the napkin estimate on annual payments for a bond in that amount was about $100,000. But I have to caution everyone, we will not really know specifically what that amount is until we're much closer to issuing the bonds, because rates change all the time. But in terms of a ballpark, that's likely where we're likely to land in terms of the cost of doing these capital projects next year. That would mean that according to this budget, we would basically seek approval from council to withdraw from several of these projects that we have committed to. Again, these are the projects that have significant obligations for us in the out years, multiple millions of dollars that we would not be able to cover with the existing revenue streams that we have. And so then we would need to withdraw from these projects in order to move forward with the other ones that we've identified. Any questions about ARP or capital?
Has the Miami Valley Regional Planning Committee released any initial guidance on what the timeline or financial impact of the build or the infrastructure legislation?
That's a good question. So with respect to the infrastructure bill, that was just passed recently. Yeah, this week.
Saturday
So
night.
we're like everybody else, sort of awaiting some guidance about what's in and what's out. My initial reaction to that is that what I am hoping, optimistic for, is that the infrastructure bill will become some resources that we can apply for, likely through the county. And the early thought is that could potentially be used for roads, potentially for things like cybersecurity or other equipment upgrades that our public safety and first responders need, those sorts of things. What I, again, would caution everybody about is that while things like ARP and the infrastructure bill provide pots of money that we can hopefully use to go do some of that work, they are not likely to be tools that we can use to offset our operating costs. I wouldn't recommend that anyway. We will still have to deal with the operating challenges that we discussed in the general fund. Basically, it's icing on the cake. If we are able to apply for and receive those funds, we may be able to offset the costs of some of our planned road projects in the future, or to do more of them using those monies. But until we have a little more clarity, I don't know what exactly that would look like.
The executive director approached that subject at the meeting last Thursday, and they have not received any guidance as what is to expect coming down from the state.
In years past, what's the typical time frame to see something like that trickle down to a local level?
Well, probably in the spring.
Finally get guidance in the spring. May not see money for a year or two.
Yeah, I think even for ARP, the interim, I'm speaking a little bit off the cuff, but I think the interim from when the law was passed to when we got interim guidance was something on the order of 6 months. Because we didn't get interim guidance until May or June, if I recall correctly. So,
Of course, we don't know how they're going to distribute the money.
Right.
Back when we had the great the Great Depression, if you will, of 2008, the federal government gave some money to the states, and ODOT therefore had money to do projects. That's how we got Spinning Road paved, as an example. But again, it didn't cost us. They just did it. We don't know the specifics of any kind of application process or allocation of how that's going to work.
the bottom line, though, is, of course, that's on our radar. And obviously, I don't want to pass up free money either. So if we can use it to go pave some roads or do other infrastructure projects, we will certainly do that.
But the big point is we have to have plans in place so that when we can apply for it. If we don't have a plan, we can't apply. And sometimes that takes 3 to 5 years to get, once you put the plan, once you give it to them, once you tell them, and then the project's still 3 to 5 years out.
Right. Well, and the good news is we have been actively working on some of the larger projects. I'm thinking of like Woodman between 35 and is it Burkhart, Kathy? Yep, that's a big one that's out there with a pretty heavy price tag. There's some of the other ones like that, or even the work that is included in this budget for us to start with the TID on design for Harshman Road. If we can get, we will spend that money to help get us partially down the road on a design. And if more federal money opens up to complete that design and do it, I think we have several things in our back pocket we can use to help to your point. Yeah.
We do now.
Yeah.
What I'm telling you is 10 years ago, we didn't have plans. And when stuff came up, we weren't able to participate.
Yep.
All I want to do is make sure, I know Kathy's been doing a great job of keeping us rolling in the right direction. But we got to keep those plans in our hip pocket and continue to add more plans, because if money, federal money does fall out of the sky, we have to be ready to be able to say, hey, Beaver Creek's not ready. We got plans here.
Right. Yeah. To jump on it. Absolutely. Point well taken. So just to summarize, in terms of now that we've sort of digested some of this, how do we actually get to where we want to go? The budget that I've presented you with, this draft budget, I view it as starting us toward a more sustainable future and building toward an effective foundation for future years, going forward beyond 22. We would not be in the position that we are in if it had not been for the public support that we received last week. And I think that's incredibly important to emphasize. And personally, how grateful I am to our voters for supporting our city and our first responders and public safety folks. We have built this budget on the best estimates that we have to date for what our revenues are likely to be. And we've taken a generally conservative approach to this budget because, as I mentioned earlier, I would rather tell you we actually have a little bit more money on the table than to come back to you and say, we don't, we have a little bit less. That said, the idea here is to improve the overall financial condition of the city so that we can continue to carry out the important public safety things that we talk to the community about, all the other priorities that are on our plate going forward. That is a process that will take some time. But to do that, we are going to acquire the tools that we need to strengthen and streamline our budget and accounting practices. I intend to get us on a very clear, defined, and regular budget process next year. Next year will be a little bit wonky in the sense that we'll be doing a financial system upgrade concurrent with trying to be more deliberate about a budget process, but we will work toward that. And then we will take this budget and use it to align our operations and services with the resources that we actually have to do the work. The goal, as I said before, is to rebuild our fund balances, pay down our debt. And as we do that next year, we will need to pay very close and consistent attention to how our revenues are coming in, where our expenditures are going. And it's likely in some respects that we may need to make a course correction mid-year, depending on how those receipts and expenditures are actually flowing. One of the things to note about the estimates that CCA gave us is that their numbers assume 100% compliance with the new income tax. Generally in these situations, there's kind of a ramp up period. You get a certain amount of compliance in the first year. People forget, they didn't know that the income tax rate had changed, especially if they're filing themselves, or employers forget and they forget to withhold the correct amounts. So in all likelihood, it is possible that our income tax revenues may come in a little bit short of where these are forecasted. The other thing to bear in mind is that the forecasts are built on income tax rolls from 2019, which is the most recent year of data that CCA has to make projections on. And the world is a bit different than it was in 2019. We don't have a good picture of whether that's more or less favorable for us. So while we've built this budget using the most reasonable assumptions we can and the best data that we have today, we're going to have to watch it. And if we need to make a course correction next year, I'll be in front of you to talk about our options and what we can do to do that. But again, the significant budget priorities that we will focus on or that we will need to focus on next year that get us out of this hole are finding some way to reduce the public service fund's reliance on transfers, because that's again about $1.4 million per year, and to do the same thing with Right Point. Finding some way to reduce the amount of money that we're on the hook for these facilities. We're kind of stuck on the debt service front just because that's debt and we will have to pay it. So these two funds are the areas of focus that I think going into next year, I'll want to be in front of you early and off and on to try to take some key action with respect to correcting that structural challenge that we talked about earlier. And that's all I have. And so I apologize for being slightly long-winded, but I wanted to be as thorough as I can, given what's in front of you today. What we're looking at going forward. So the general feedback, I suppose, that I need from council is the draft budget and the individual line items that I provided you with. I'm happy to answer questions on, or I can direct those questions to staff. I feel pretty confident that we are in a place where once you all are comfortable with what this looks like and how the 2022 budget is structured, we can move forward very rapidly with getting that in front of you for approval, so that we can take it and start watching and use the next 12 months to really dig in the weeds and course correct as necessary. That's all I have.
Yeah. I feel like I'm gonna be the one asking a bunch of questions because this is my first time looking at it. And I guess maybe Chris, this might be for you because I know you're largely part in personnel. The increases in workers' comp, Medicare, health insurance premiums, I know you stayed at 35%, but looking at the budget, at least I just used 103, Fund 103 as an example. Workers' comp had 155% increase. Health insurance had a 338% increase from 2019. So I'm just trying to get a better understanding on like what I'm looking at here.
Zach, just to clarify, what page are you on?
Let me find it again.
And I apologize. I realized after I had published this that our memo template does not have page numbers on it. So I'll be correcting that.
On my PDF, it's page, I don't know,
What is the fund number?
103.
Okay,
The account number would be 5131 5141 and 5143. Because in 2019, 2020, we had a $7,000 health insurance premium, an $8,000 health insurance premium, and then a 36,000. We're projecting 36,000. That means with a 36% increase, what the city manager stated, that seems a little bit higher than 36% just by doing some simple math.
Yes, the other thing to consider is some of these line items are not inflated by percentages. They're inflated by the actual employer share of costs that we have to pay on a per capita basis. So for example, if somebody picks a family plan, we pay out of pocket a set dollar fee to support that plan. It's not a percentage increase. It's just whatever we're on the hook for. And what we're assuming here is generally the most conservative assumption we can make, which is that everybody picks the most expensive plan. So depending on the line item that you're looking at, in general, the insurance cost, the premium costs go up 35%, but where internally we felt like it made more sense to make more of a worst case assumption, we went ahead and inflated it a little bit more.
But we have 3 years of data here, almost 4 years, that states were around this. And I understand like the worst case, but I mean, that seems like, that's a huge difference. I mean, like 338% is a large percentage number, at least from my uneducated perspective. I don't know if that's like common standard budget practice of that high of an amount or.
I would say on this particular department, Mr. Manager, this might be in reference to the personnel adjustments that we had discussed in related to the finance department.
No, that's correct too. Yeah, and I should note that the only, thank you, Chris, for reminding me of that. The only personnel adjustment that this budget contemplates is an additional person in the finance department to help backfill for those staff and to learn the process of the budget and to help implement the new budget system. In the event that basically it's a way of helping us preserve our institutional capacity going forward, so that if folks in finance at some point decide to separate, that we don't have our finance department evaporate overnight. Because then I won't be able to pay anybody any checks, and that won't be very pretty. So, no, and thank you, Chris. And so to Chris's point, and Zach, to your point as well, those line items will look a little bit funny because we have baked in some assumptions then about what a new person would likely generate for us in that regard.
So yeah, 108, 5141 for the community development. That's a 154% increase year over year. So I mean, that's half of what we're projecting percentage wise of an increase from.
I can address that change. So right now, currently, we have 107 and 108, both cover the community development department. So since they were previously two separate departments. So we're taking all those personnel expenditures from 107 that we see this year and in previous years and moving those to 108. So 107 will be completely defunded and 108 will include all the community development personnel.
So and this brings me to my question, would be, I would like to see, if we can, see that combined number for, if those departments were already together in 19 and 20, so that I could, so I've got something to compare to.
Oh, do you mean in terms of adjusting the actuals to also show the combined?
Yeah.
My apologies. Yeah, I can do that.
If that's possible.
I can do that.
I mean, because when I look at this, and if the public would look at this, they're going to say, and yeah, you've given an explanation, but you went from 115,000 in 21 to 265 in 22. That's more than double.
Yep.
That doesn't.
Yeah. No, point well taken. And it is a function of us combining those line items. And to your point, I did it for
get it, but I'd
22.
like to see it so that I can compare it.
No, I'm happy to do that.
Hopefully that's what I'm providing is like what the public would see because I know.
Right,
further.
no, and I mean, and coming in, I mean, yeah, we've got a nice little explanation that we combined them, but that doesn't show me.
Yep.
Other questions? Brenda?
I'm assuming that the Budget Committee did not have an opportunity to contribute to this draft budget.
That's correct. I've been in a bit of a rush mode to get this out in front of you because we're nearing the end of the year. My advice, I guess, or recommendation would be, especially as I guess in terms of approach, I would recommend if we can get a budget for next year in place, then we absolutely should use a budget committee and council work sessions to get input on how to address the issues that we've talked about tonight going forward when we start the 2023 budget process. And I have personally worked with some committees like that where that can be very helpful. We can talk about the benefits and trade-offs of making certain decisions and to get the input from residents who sit and serve on that committee as far as what those impacts may be. And that can inform how we put next year's budget together. And if we have to do mid-year course corrections or something, what that would end up looking like and what we move forward with in terms of recommendations.
So right now we're looking at involving them in the early part of next year.
I would say throughout next year, yes. As long as council is comfortable with
Continuously
that.
throughout next year.
Correct. Yeah. Because as I mentioned, this is going to be, I envision this as being a process where every time we get receipts in from CCA, which is about twice a month, that we're watching this stuff and we're looking at budget to actual revenues, expenses, and checking in and trying to stay on top of that. And if we feel like we may need to correct to work with with council, work with our budget committee, work with other partners to try to figure out the best way to do that.
Thank you.
Other questions for the city manager or the staff? And, it's been common practice in these work sessions to treat them almost like a college seminar where we get a lot of information and sometimes we come up with questions later. I know that the deputy mayor and I met with Josh earlier today, and I know that his door is open and his phone is always on. So as questions come up, he's incredibly easy to get a hold of. I know that questions will pop up once we adjourn, I'm sure, but I want to thank Josh for getting us this information with such time and such timeliness for us to be able to have a good amount of prep in advance of the meeting, because this is a lot to digest, but I think that it was well presented.
Thank you.
I'd like to say that this is probably the best I've seen in a budget in 12, 15 years. And it gives me, as a layperson that doesn't do this every day, the information I need to make the decisions that we're going to have to make. But it gives me all the information that I, and in a format that I can digest. So thank you for that.
I'm glad it's helpful. And again, I need to thank the staff, because I was not a one-man show doing this, and I won't be a one-man show going forward. And it's, the folks put a lot of time
Thank
into double
everybody,
checking my
but-
work too.
but this-
Absolutely.
This is kind of, and Brenda probably was
Yeah.
more into this than I was, but this is almost exactly what we've been asking for the last 5 to 7 years. And we get iterations towards this, but this, this is just about perfect.
Point of clarification.
Yes, ma'am.
What are the next steps with the budget?
That's an excellent question. I would anticipate, I had actually talked to Katie a little bit earlier today. We are at a place where if you did feel comfortable, we could put this on the agenda for our first reading next week. I do think that that's a bit of an aggressive timeline, given what you have to digest and to work through. And that doesn't give us a lot of time if you have other follow-up questions. Katie and I talked about potentially moving forward with a first reading at the first meeting in December. And we could go forward if we needed to have another work session in that midweek, second week of December, just to follow up on any questions that may come up in another work session environment like this, and then do a second reading in the third week of December and actually get it passed by the end of the year.
Well, that's the 16th
16th, thank
is
you.
the second meeting. We haven't given any of the department heads a chance to comment anything they would care to say about the budget. And I think if I would like to hear from them, because I know this isn't what they're wanting to see. And I think this is the appropriate time that if you have any concerns that we need to know about, I think you need to please take the time to share that.
I would like to point out that we had requested a backhoe because our backhoe is on its last leg. Instead of getting a new one, you'll see an increase in our rental line item. And there will be some maintenance costs along the way. But just, that was my only objection to the budget.
Well, I'm going to make a statement. Don't expect me to vote for any other piece of equipment unless it goes to fire and police, because I'm not real happy with what happened with this budget and kind of some of the projections. So we need to make sure that we're being due diligent in what we're doing moving forward to get where we need to be and where we want to be.
Can you clarify what you mean by that?
I clarify that I'm not in support of how things ended up. I understand where we're at and why we had to get there, but I'm very disappointed of some of the projections we had to where we're now. So I want to make sure that if we're spending any money, that it's going to where it needs to go. for new equipment, new purchases and things like that.
Other comments and questions? It sounds like we're almost into council member comments. But I did want to make sure that, as the deputy mayor asked, if there was any other department heads that wanted to give us any of their perspective. I know you worked very closely with the city manager, as he mentioned. But taking the silence as an indicator, I will thank the city manager and we will move on from that work
Well,
session.
Have the unions, I mean, what's the council's relation with that when like police and fire, like our labor relations, when they get to kind of privy over this? I mean, what does that look like from a council review perspective and getting their input from them?
What I can speak to, my intention is, I don't want to be out in front of council with, my priority is council first. Once we get to a place where we have a draft budget that council's comfortable with, I intend to go meet with all of our union representatives to get to know them, because I haven't had time to do that yet. But also to provide a very similar sort of overview on the budget and kind of what we're looking at and how we plan on addressing it going forward. And so it'll be an active thing that I'll be doing in the coming weeks.
All right. And Zach, although you are only a council member elect, I will treat that as your first council member comment. It was really a question, but way to go. And we will begin with Mr. Maxfield.
I have none.
Thank you. Ms. Franklin, welcome back stateside.
Thank you. Since I missed the last meeting, I just want to say thank you to all the residents out there that voted yes for the income tax increase. I truly appreciate it, and I know that many people in this city are very appreciative of it. So I just wanted to say thank you since I wasn't here last week. And also to staff and the city manager for putting this information together quite quickly. I even joked with Josh while I was gone. I said I meant to text him and say, how many nights did you not sleep? Because the amount of data that has been collected to present this is phenomenal to be done in such a short period of time. So thank you. That's it.
Bev?
I think you did a great job on this, and I also will have a sheet of paper with a whole bunch of stuff on here for you
Okay,
later on.
thank you.
All right. I would thank the staff and the city manager for putting this presentation together and for presenting it in a way that allows us to easily discuss and go through. I would echo some of Jesse's comments that we have high hopes after the income tax increase. And I want to thank April for pushing us as a group to make that happen this November, because I didn't know that over the summer if we were going to get there, but April was the real powerhouse behind getting us on board and getting that in front of the citizens, and the citizens responded. And we are making a historic investment in public safety in Riverside. The amounts of revenue that will come from this ballot initiative going to police and fire, not just next year, not just the next 12 months, but for years and years to come, is going to reshape the way that our citizens interact and how people in the city can really feel self-assured the level of services they're going to receive. We did not get into the position we're in overnight. We will not get out overnight, but we will get there. And of that, I am confident. Deputy Mayor.
I'm good.
Brenda.
I have nothing.
And Mr. Denning. All right. Well, with that, is there a motion to adjourn? We have a motion from Mr. Denning and a second from Ms. Campbell. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, say nay. Meeting adjourned at 7:05.